Those of you who have read Jeff Thompson's kind foreword to my first martial arts book, Mordred's Victory, will know that my published material was always inclined to step outside of conventional martial arts topics. Jeff's main reservation about my martial arts writing career was that it would not hold me. The topic was a regular point he made in our personal discussions. However, rather than just plunging further down the proverbial rabbit hole with an even greater desire to remove all evidence of martial arts relevancy, I propose we introduce a new turn in the burrow. My new reoccurring theme will be Everything is Martial Arts. Don't worry, I'm not going to abandon critical thinking and start with biased foregone conclusions before collecting dubious evidence. These are going to be intentionally whimsical discussions and fun challenges on how martial artists might view other interests. Besides, martial arts have far stronger connections and influences over history and culture than might seem obvious. Religious scriptures of all the world's extant major religions feature descriptions of fighting disciplines. Most deities within the Hindu-Buddhist pantheon have their own signature weapon and are often considered originators of certain fighting disciplines. The Torah describes Jewish heroes who used innovative weapons against their opponents, the Philistines, who forbade them to smelt or work metal. From Samson's use of an ass's jawbone as a club against multiple opponents to David's use of a shepherd's sling against the giant Goliath, the image presented by these Judaic and later biblical warriors is comparable to the debunked yet pervasive myths of Okinawan peasantry developing kobujitsu to use their farming tools against oppressive Japanese samurai. Such veneration of resourcefulness might be found in modern combative and self-defense training that promotes the use of incidental weaponry. If you'll forgive an Anglo-centric perspective, this brings us onto something we might call the Robin Hood archetype. This character was introduced to me by my grandfather and was probably one of my first martial arts heroes. A folkloric character, he may have taken his name from the mischievous sprite Robin Goodfellow, an alternative name for Puck, but the earliest clear textual reference of Robin Hood tie him to his longbow expertise. Hood's weapon of choice was a symbol for the English yeoman, the social class most known to represent medieval archers. The martial art of English archery was often credited with winning decisive battles in the 100 Years' War. Through his development in ballads, poems, plays and narrative fiction over the centuries, Robin Hood displayed skills in other martial arts, including swordsmanship and quarterstaff fighting. In many ways, this figure, which we can accept as a cross-cultural universal symbol of the fighting underdog, was defined by his martial art identity. Robin Hood and his folkloric equivalents across the globe were experts in guerrilla warfare, a reoccurring occupation of legendary martial artists. Song Jian's rebellion against the Song dynasty in 12th century China would become an inspirational figure for the veneration of outlaws in subsequent centuries. He and his army of outlaws are all given distinctive martial arts identities in the 14th century novel The Water Margin. Japan's Ishikawa Goemon and his band of ninjas became Japan's Sengoku period Robin Hood equivalent. They stole from the rich to distribute amongst the poor. Although referred simply as a thief in the first record of his supposed existence, Goemon quickly developed into an anti-establishment folk hero during the Edo period and added to rapidly developing ninjutsu mythology. The Robin Hood underdog archetype, far from being unique to England as a concept, is a recurring ideal in martial arts subculture. Oppressed people find hope in the idea that they can tip the balance in their favour against stronger bullies by having knowledge of combative systems. In real documented history and to this day, guerrillas have succeeded often through not winning but simply by not losing. They weaponise their environment against better armed opponents. If you think about it, Robin Hood, in most of the popular stories, doesn't vanquish and defeat the Sheriff of Nottingham and King Prince John. He simply stays out the battle until King Richard I returns. On an individualistic level, this idea can translate to small beating big by having access to better skills. Martial arts folklore, from ancient sources to modern films and television shows, continue to push this motivational narrative. Think of the unarmed innocent defending himself against the gunman. Ancient mythology across the world not only features wars, duels and fighting contests, but also even provides fanciful origin stories of certain disciplines. For example, Theseus and Heracles of Greek mythology are often credited with creating the hybrid combat sport of pankration. Crossing over into religion again, we might compare these origin stories to Indian wrestling scholars crediting the creation of their oldest recorded organised fighting discipline, the combat wrestling art of Mallayuddha, to the deity Krishna, the eighth avatar of Vishnu and a supreme god in his own right. Norse religion made their thunder god Thor god of wrestling. He famously lost a hard-endured contest against Eli, the personification of old age, who was representative of Utgarda Loki's old nurse. Today, the Scandinavian martial art of Glima, both in its self-defence and sporting form, is said to be a surviving system of the Viking Age. Meanwhile, Chinese folklore credits the rebellious king and god of war Qiyu, often depicted as a fantastic anthropomorphic composition of animals and metal, as the inventor of weapons. Activities as distinct as the modern art of parkour and the ancient Olympic sport of javelin throwing have strong historic connections to the martial arts. The European tradition of mounting a horse from the left is a callback to soldiers over many centuries avoiding getting entangled with their swords. There's even a theory surrounding the origin of the fist bump gesture, with the earliest coming from the dancers of ancient Egypt. But it has also been suggested that Europeans at least may have adopted it from boxers. Speaking of the martial art of boxing, there's little denying the way it has flavoured the English vernacular. Knockout, gloves off, punching above one's weight and throwing in the towel are still popular phrases used today with little thought of their boxing roots. The sport's most notorious of fouls, hitting below the belt, has become a metaphor for saying or doing something unfair. On the ropes, a position a fighter typically avoids in the boxing ring, has become a term to simply mean being in trouble. Some boxing metaphors have become so popular that the original definition has become secondary. Coming up to scratch, now meaning to meet a satisfactory level or a required minimum standard, stems from the old bare-knuckle days when rounds commenced after fighters made their way back to a designated scratch line. Down and out is now infrequently used to describe a fighter who can no longer continue and has become a noun and an adjective to describe a destitute person. Professional wrestling's own brand of cant slang is in a library of its own, but grappling arts in general have made a direct impact on our language. People wrestle and grapple with problems when they are having difficulty understanding or managing something. Headlock, although not a universally accepted slang phrase, often crops up as a metaphor to describe one entity restricting another in some legal or legislative fashion. With the growing popularity of Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes and mixed martial arts as a spectator sport, tapping out is also becoming a burgeoning phrase to compete with throwing in the towel. Martial arts are quite literally part of the English language, and I'd love to hear from bilingual and multilingual listeners who can share phrases and terms that had their origins in fighting disciplines. Martial arts also have a strong presence throughout great literature. Consider the ancient Mesopotamian poem that is the 18th century BCE epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the earliest surviving work of notable literature, where the titular hero wrestles the tamed wild man and his future sidekick Enkidu. Drawing from the scant description of the bout, it sounds like they fought a form of belt wrestling where girdles were gripped. The bout is significant in many ways within the story and becomes a reoccurring trope throughout mythology, folklore and fiction. Homer's epic poems The Iliad and the Odyssey feature descriptions of the three distinct styles of Grecian unarmed combat, wrestling, boxing and pancration, as well as armed duels with javelins, shields and swords, along with some incidental weaponry. In the case of the Iliad, this all occurs during an actual war. The Odyssey's final 4 books has the poem's hero string a bow whilst in disguise, perform an act of masterful archery, and then, using the remaining arrows along with swords and spears, sets about massacring the suitors who have overrun his home. As can be imagined, the ancient Indian epics with their martial arts deities and stories of wars are full of descriptions of fighting disciplines. The Mahabharata has some particularly descriptive examples. This includes an unarmed, no-holds-barred fight to the death between Bhima and Jamutta that includes headbutts, knee strikes, punches, throws and kicks, ending with Bhima whirling his opponent around his head 100 times before dashing him to death on the ground. However, the lengthy duel between Arjuna and Karna would give the most elaborate of anime conflicts a run for their money. The fight features traditional weapons such as bows and swords, incidental weapons such as rocks and even trees, as well as invoking mystical powers that bring about mass destruction of each side's troops.